we move into Jacob moving closer and closer to home. Last week we talked about the Lord speaking with Jacob and telling him that it's time to go home. And Jacob went and he talked to his wives, and he says, your father, you see how his countenance has changed against me. He don't like me anymore. I run into this at schools and stuff sometimes with the kids. They're like, well, they just don't like me no more. And sometimes we don't have a clue why. Jacob knew exactly what was going on because Laban had begun to get disgusted because whose flock was growing? Jacob's flock was growing, and it wasn't just growing by a little bit. It was growing massively. And Jacob had recognized the Lord's touch in all of these things. And whenever he begins to take off, it tells us in Genesis 31:17, then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods, which he had gotten the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. He's got his stuff together. He's got his wives together. He's got his kids together. And he says, it's time to hit the road. Let's get out of here before anything more raises up. Remember last week when we talked, what had Leah and Rachel said? He looks unto us as if we're strangers. He don't even recognize us, who we are anymore. He doesn't know us like he used to. Now, did the relationship change? Well, yeah, obviously it did. But what did it revolve around? Stuff. How many times have we seen families be tore up over stuff? I think every single one of us have had something in our lives, or family in our lives, where stuff has gotten hold. Our background leading into this morning, of course, is Genesis 32, that we're going to be looking at the chapter. But the first 23 verses begin to break down that process. When Jacob left the land of Canaan, what had he done? He'd stolen whose blessing, in a sense, stolen? He'd stolen his brother's, hadn't he? No more was it Esau's. Now, did the Lord already tell him that was coming? Yeah, Lord done told Mama that the blessing will go to the younger instead of the older. The Lord had done told Mama that this was going to happen. Now, the way that he got it, was it right? No. What I have learned in my life, just to give a quick recap of that time myself with it, when we do things the way God wants us to do them, we tend to have a lot more peace about what's going on, right? Ever since this moment, there was turmoil between the brothers. You think Esau sat and stewed at night sometimes, saying, I can't wait to get my hands on Jacob. I'm going to tear him limb from limb. Well, if we know Jacob, and we remember who Jacob was, he was smooth-skinned, wasn't he? He wasn't one that was really built to battle those things. He left. There was anger. There was hatred when he left. That's part of the reason that he did leave. And now he's headed back. When he left Canaan, God was the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. But he was not the God of Jacob quite yet, was he? But God can still use that. So verses 1 through 8, we see, or 32, 1 through 8, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host. And he called that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau, thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now. And I have oxen, and asses, flocks, and men servants, and women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord, that I may find grace in thy sight. How does he address his brother? He's going to give him gifts, and he calls him my Lord, doesn't he? He's like, my Lord. Now, he had the blessing. Do you ever kind of put yourself in a lower state when you come across somebody, so that way it eases the conversation into starting? Sometimes every one of us, because we've all dealt with it on both ends, that beautiful word condescending. Some people are condescending to us. And I remember Todd when he was little, which he's not little anymore, but when he was little, we were in Barberville, and he was we couldn't even get him to say y'all. It was awful. We was living in the middle of Knox County, Kentucky, and he would not say y'all. Like, they don't understand you all. Say y'all. And he was like, I just can't do it. There was a little girl come up to him, talking to him, and if you've ever spoken to someone from Barberville, it's Barberville. Anybody else heard it that way? Barberville. It's not Barberville, it's Barberville. Well, this girl kept saying Barberville, Barberville. Todd goes, do you mean Barberville? Me and her neither stand over there ducking our heads going, oh, please don't hate him, please don't hate him. She took herself, and she was the older girl. She was, sweet about the whole thing, and she knew Todd had a different dialect at that time, and she said, yes, Todd, Barberville, and said it back to him. She wasn't being condescending. She was trying to ease the conversation. Sometimes those wordings make all the difference in the world, doesn't it? Proverbs tells us the soft answer turneth away wrath. Sometimes the soft introduction calms wrath before it ever gets started. Our voice level makes a world of difference between people, doesn't it? So whenever he sends these servants to go say, I'm here, he says, first of all, I have all of these things I'm bringing with me. And then he says, my Lord, that I may find grace in thy sight. What is grace to us? Grace to us is almost a step of God's forgiveness to us, right? That Christ came and grace was imparted to us. So what is Jacob asking for here? He's asking for Esau to forgive him. Now, after verse 5, it tells us in verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. Now wait a minute. I just asked for forgiveness, and you ever have built things up in your mind that it's going to be the worst thing you've ever dealt with in your life, and you're terrified? And then Jacob is seeking forgiveness. He's seeking grace, and he's thinking to himself, but the land is yours. Why are you bringing 400 men with you? It's an army. He's coming after me with everything I've got. So how does Jacob respond to that? Jacob begins to, first he pleads and he praises God. But he takes his company and he splits them up, doesn't he? He splits them apart so that way if one of them gets overtaken, the other one can survive. If the other one gets overtaken, the first one can survive. He's saying, whatever it is, we'll try to get them to attack one with that 400 people, and we'll make it by. Jacob has prepared his heart. Jacob's prayer in verse 9, Jacob said, and this is a major turning point, I feel, O God, my father Abraham, O God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidst unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. Listen to these words, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become two bands. You know what he said? I am not what? Worthy. I am not worthy. Jacob had learned how to approach God, in a sense, hadn't he? I am not worthy. He recognizes what here? One, he's praying to God, I've had to split it up because I don't trust what Esau's going to do. But I trust that you said you're going to deal well with me. He says, I've crossed over into the land of my kindred, the kindred that you promised me you would take care of me in. So Jacob, in a sense, is saying, I'm trying to be obedient, Lord, but the whole thought of my brother and these 400 men, it's terrified me to the point that I'd split my people up. Now, Jacob made the decision to split the people before he ever consulted God, didn't he? Now, God's still going to work out, but he says, beginning in verse 11, deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. And thou sayest, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Jacob says, I am scared. Do you know that we as people tend to buck up like we ain't scared of nothing, right? We don't want to admit we're terrified. And that's one of the biggest things I feel more for little boys than it is for little girls, that little bit of machismo that sets in on little boys, and they're like, yeah, I ain't scared of nothing. Spider, ah! And they're jumping. You know, I've seen it now, whether it's a spider, what it is. There's a young man, I remember when I was, several years ago, I don't even know, Todd was maybe 1 or 2 at the time. I dressed up just as a goofy-looking clown one time to give out candy at my in-laws' house for the trick-or-treat time. And they came up, and I was dressed up as a clown. Well, when they see me, his mom called them, was like, our boy is terrified of clowns. So I went out in the back, and I stood where he wouldn't even see me anymore. And that little boy grew up to be a boy who's kind of macho, but he never did like clowns. He passed away earlier than people were expected for in a motorcycle accident. But this young man, he didn't like them. We all have those things that terrify us, right? We all do, no matter how brave that we are. And the best thing for us to do is to admit those things to God before we get ourselves deep. What does Jacob say? He's not saying, he didn't even, when he split the bands up, he didn't say, be prepared to attack and we'll flank them and we'll take them. But he's still going in peace. And he just is honest with God. There's no better way to be when we approach God but to be honest with Him. So he gets real straight and he says, I fear Him. That He's going to come and He's going to kill me. He's going to kill my wives, and He's going to kill all the children. He's not going to kill the livestock. What would He do with the livestock? That'd be the spoils of war, so to speak. He would take all them things in and they would become His. So, over verses 13 through 21, what does Jacob do? He prepares a present, doesn't he? Let's get a present. So, as we come to Him, that we can present to Him this present. Well, nobody turns away a good present, do they? Now, He doesn't waste, anything small either. It tells us that He gives goats, he and she goats, He gives ewes, He gives rams, He gives camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls and 20 she donkeys and 10 foals. And man, He loaded it up, didn't He? That gift right there that's a king's gift. He's recognizing that Esau is taking care of that land, and he is recognizing. Now, we don't know exactly the length of time that was there, or how long Jacob was there, at least, or unless I just missed it in my study. But we know that he was there for the very least how many years? 14. He served 7 years he served 7 years for Rachel, and Laban tricked him, and then he worked another 7 years, right? And then it's the point that once those kids all had gotten born and were able to do stuff, that's when he began talking to him about it's time to go. We've grown so much. So we know there's been a great amount of time that has passed, and they've not seen one another. One thing I have learned, sometimes it's our fear that outlasts the actual rage of the one that we're scared of. And our fear is debilitating. What do you think had kept Jacob from returning home? It doesn't say exactly, but we see right here in these verses, he was terrified, wasn't he? Fear can keep us from doing what God wants us to do. God said, go back. This is an extreme step of faith of Jacob as he's growing in faith to go back to where God tells him to go. Verses 22 and 23, there's a little bit more preparation. Then we get into our text. Genesis 32:24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Now there's going to be a lot of talk about this man over the next set of verses. It never once says exactly who the man is, does it? Now, there's a lot of different speculation on it, but without the Bible being completely 100% definitive on it, we have to be very careful to understand that we don't have everything exact. But now, he says that he was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. I can't wrestle with somebody for 5 minutes, y'all. And I think of those Greco-Roman wrestlers, how much energy and how much, sweat is dispersed from their bodies, and how weak they are after those small wrestling matches that you may watch during the Olympics. But they wrestled all night. Now, it said he woke in the middle of the night and then he moved them. So if you take the middle of the night straight up as midnight, and then you combine that with they wrestled the break of your day being between 6 and 7 o'clock, depending on all kinds of different stuff. They've wrestled for hours, haven't they? They've wrestled for a long time back and forth. Now, as I said, it talks a lot about the man. We're not going to get too tore up and let that control the thing. But it says the time frame breaking a day suggests that light might unmask the man's identity. Well, if you're wrestling with something in the dark, you can't see it for certain. When the day breaks and you get a good view of it, you kind of know a little bit better. If you ever hear anybody see something in the dark and say, well, what exactly did you see? Well, I don't know. It's kind of dark. Right? All the cop shows do it. All these things do it. Well, I just can't really tell you what I've seen. It was too dark for me to see exactly what was there. What we do know is that it tells us in verse 24 and 25, or 25 says, and when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him, or as he wrestled with him. Can man out-strengthen God? Absolutely not. There's no way, no how. I always like the way that it's written in Jeremiah and Lamentations. His mercies are new every morning. It's by His mercy, as the Scripture says, that you and I aren't dead already. That we've not already had to pay the penalty for our sins. So this is not saying that Jacob was such a man, he was able to wrestle with God and stand his ground. Now, why is this important? Now, I know the lesson talks about it in some ways, but we have to understand, back in some of those pagan religions that was going on around there, they felt like they could battle back and forth. They had thought processes with their gods that they battled all the time. At least, I don't remember the names of the gods. I probably wouldn't say it correct anyway. Not that I'd be offending them because they're not real. But that one of them used to kill the other one every year, and if ever the other one prevailed, then the world would be over. This was the thought process of some of those pagan rituals that would go on. And I do like the way the lesson puts it. The suggestion that Almighty God or His personal messenger could not defeat a sinful mortal is preposterous. In other words, ain't gonna happen. Even if it's an angel of God, just an angel, as some suggest that it is, even that, Jacob would not be able to prevail over him. Why? Who sent the angel, the man, or even if it was Christ Himself, a theophany, who sent him? And when God sends them, He sends them in whose power? His power. And if they're sending His power, you and I definitely cannot defeat it. We cannot overcome it. But now we see that he touched the hollow of his thigh. I think it's interesting, I hope to get to the end of it, the way that they commemorate some of that. Verses 26 says, he said, let me go, for the day breaketh, and he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Jacob feels at this moment he is fighting for his what? His blessing. I'm not going to let you go. Now, I want to tell you a story. I've got a hold of people bigger than me before and thought that I was in control. And they say, I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to let you go. They're just calmly saying, let me go. You ever gotten one of those? Maybe wrestle with your brothers or sisters or with somebody that just like, I'm not going to let go. I'm not going to let go. I've got a hold of you. I'm not going to let go. And they're mercifully saying, you need to let me go or I'm going to have to force you to let me go. I think this is this moment of grace that's going here. He's saying, you need to let me go. And Jacob, he's proud of himself, isn't he? I'm not going to let you go until I get my blessing. Verse 26 tells us Jacob was willing to fight. Not only was the sun rising over the horizon, but as the lesson says, God was beginning to illuminate Jacob's heart. You think Jacob had come to a little bit of an understanding of who or what he was wrestling with? Well, we know if you've read through the lesson later in Scriptures, he says, I've wrestled with God, doesn't he? But he says, Jacob's gaining a little bit of insight. Now, the word blessed, the Hebrew word blessed, means to endow with power for success. So, blessing does not necessarily mean that He gives you what you want or what you need, but He empowers you to go do it. So, sometimes we as Christians, we sit and we think back to ourselves, we think, oh, well, I've been blessed. And we talk about it in a past tense way, that I have been given all of these things. But lots of times, in church life, in our individual lives, in our family lives, when we are blessed, we're empowered to go with success. Now, this is not the Joel Osteen and those baloney preachers' success. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about success of going into what God wants you to do. God said, go. Jacob has been faithful. He's going. God says, I will take care and deal well with you. Jacob says, okay, well, finish my blessing here. I'm not going to let go until I've got it. Endow me with power for success. Why did Jacob strive for this reminder? Who was coming to meet him? His brother and 400 men. His mindset, as you shared, it's like an army was coming after him. He's terrified, and he's admitted, I am scared. And when he finds out he's scared, God begins to deal with him in a ginger way. I remember watching a movie years ago, and we've all dealt with kids at some point where they say, I'm scared of this or I'm scared of that, right? Darkness is one of those things a lot of kids have trouble to overcome. They struggle with monsters under the bed or monsters in their closet. And of course, Disney made monsters a good thing. They're fun. But Disney does a whole lot of weird things. But when we sit and we think about what was going on, there's a movie I watched years ago where these boys were in like a military boarding school kind of thing, and he kept coming down and waking up the general's bed. He says, Major, I'm scared. He said, there's a monster in my closet. So finally, the man gets tired of it. Now, he wasn't daddy. He was like a drill sergeant for those kids. He walked up there. He pulled out his sidearm and pow, 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 starts firing in the middle of the house, in the middle of the night, and filling holes in that closet. And he turns around and looks at that boy, and he says, if he's still in there, he ain't happy. Admitting our fear is a big thing. Finding someone who can really alleviate that fear makes a difference. Jacob said, I'm scared of my brother. God sends an angel to wrestle with him, and in the midst of that, Jacob says, give me my blessing. Put a blessing on me. True transformation leads believers to value and seek God's blessing above all else. Jacob knew this blessing was, this one that was wrestling with was from God. And he says that later on. In verse 30, he says, I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Verse 27, before we get there, I don't get too far ahead. He says that he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. Did the angel know who he was wrestling with? Oh, yeah. They're not going to go wrestle with some random stranger, are they? God said, go wrestle with this guy and deal with him. His name's Jacob. God, nothing surprises God. He knows all things, just like when he was in the garden. And he says, I was in the garden, I was looking for you. Where were you? Adam, where were you, Eve? Oh, well, I was afraid because I was naked. Who told you that you were naked? See, God gives us opportunities to be open and honest. Jacob simply responds with his name. Jacob. What do you think of in a thought process? If he's going to get the blessing, he has to be called by name to give the blessing. He is there. Now, we now begin to turn here shortly into Jacob's name changing. I don't want to get too far ahead. The man in verse 28 says, he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, or Israel, depends on who you talk to. For as a prince hast thou found power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Giving a name to someone is a sign of what? Authority over them. And I love how the lesson ties into Daniel and how the names of those boys were changed. When a king comes in and he conquers somebody and he takes those people for his own, what does he do? He changes their name. Jesus in the Scriptures tells us that in Revelation that we have a new name. We have a new identity. Whenever we become His, when He comes in and He conquers sin in our lives, we turn our lives over to Him, He's conquered us. We become a new creation. We become new in Him. Now, God's promises to Abraham are going to flow through because He's going to use Jacob or Israel as the leadership into going into this land to reestablish who they were from. We don't always understand the journey that God has us on, but we must be faithful to continue the journey He's got for us. Jacob is dealing with different things. He's wrestled with an angel. He's had to keep everybody happy and in good spirits as they're traveling this long distance to go. And now he's getting ready to fight, he thinks, his brother. So fear does begin to set upon him. The man's assertion that Jacob had prevailed did not mean he defeated God in a wrestling match. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. Here, victory was in Jacob's submission to God. That's why when we sing songs like Victory in Jesus, how do we have victory in Jesus? We give ourselves to Him. We submit to Him. That's where victory comes from. God says, I'll give you the victory through Jesus. Not you or I. We can't earn the victory because of how well we wrestle against God. Matter of fact, He much more prefers it that we just do what He asks us to do. Jesus says, you'll know me, or know that they're mine by the way that they obey my commandments. Christ does not want to wrestle with us. He wants us to be faithful followers. Verse 29, Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. He's not going to give him his name. Jacob's, wanting to know the name. Yeah. He's like, it's like he was saying, you know who you've wrestled with online. You know what's going on. You see me face to face now. I think it's interesting, as you said that after verse 29, when he says, tell me your name, and he says, why are you asking my name? That in verse 30, Jacob responds with, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. You see, and I see this with our society. We seek God face to face on so many different levels of things. Yet we still have to ask Him if it was Him. When we know who God is, when we see Him, we recognize Him immediately, don't we? We know who these people are so quickly. When we've not seen people for quite a while, all of a sudden we can come across and see them as like we recognize them. It just goes right back to that point of understanding that we had. But Jacob, he is wanting to know the name. He wants to know if he's right, I think is part of it. He says, I have seen. Now, the word Peniel means face of God. Jacob claimed to have seen God face to face. Now, there's a couple of different things with here. If somebody's seen God face to face, what's supposed to happen to them? Supposed to die immediately, right? In Hosea chapter 12, verse 4, they refer to the angel as a man. In 1 John 4:12, it harmonizes with with that because in 1 John 4:12, John says, no one has seen God. And on the other hand, John elsewhere recorded that Jesus said, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. So there's this massive connection here as Jacob is beginning to develop into a man of faith. But how he finishes that when he says, I have seen God face to face and my life is preserved. In other words, he could have killed me, but he didn't. You think about these different men of the Old Testament especially that see God in a sense. You think of Moses on the Mount. You think of all these different, Isaiah even in his vision. Isaiah was terrified when he seen them up there, and he recognized how sinful he was. He's saying, my life is preserved. I have received grace. Jacob went into this wanting grace from Esau, but he's going to walk out of it having grace from the Lord. He's going to have his name changed. He passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. The man had a limp for the rest of his life. It never was going to go away. It says he halted upon his thigh. He took a very large amount of care with that. I would imagine, of course, now if you watch any of these movies that they depict it, what does Jacob tend to have from there on? It's cane, doesn't he? Something to help him walk along. He's going to have this. Well, now, one thing that I have noticed in many lives, and I hope that we notice it in ourselves and in others that come to Christ, once Christ has touched us, we look different. We seem as someone different than what we were. Jacob still was outside the geographical boundary of Canaan, but he's getting ready to go in. The end of that second paragraph under verse 31, it says, Jacob must go into Canaan so that he could continue his assignment as heir to God's promises. He had a long journey. And he could have easily said, I am tired. I'm just tired. Have you ever done that? I'm just tired. Just a little bit more. I have to do that to myself when I'm walking on the treadmill. You said when you got on here you was going to work a certain amount of time. Just a few more minutes. Just a few more minutes. And then an hour down the road, you're going just a few more minutes. Have to keep going. We have to stay aligned with God. Why is it important for us to stay connected with God when we're on these journeys? Because He's the ultimate encourager. He reminds us that we're walking in the way He wants us to walk, even when times are tough. Verse 32. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. Thus the practice has no legal basis. There's no legal basis for this. They just did it. Does your family have things you do as traditions because it means something to you? Maybe a step that you took. Maybe you halted from taking something. And I love how it uses the phrase unto this day. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses wrote the book of Genesis. So when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, we have to understand that this is, anywhere from, as it says, 450 to 500 years beyond this occurrence. So that means that this tradition was so deep that they still kept it. And it says in Jewish life, they still sustain from it in the practice of the 21st century. In our century today, they still will not eat of that sinew because they remember. And they look on it as a sign of struggle. There's three things that it really points out, and I like the way it puts it, so we're going to do it and then we'll close out. Jacob's transformation was marked by three significant signs. First, Jacob's name was changed. Jacob became who? Israel. Second, Jacob named the location Peniel because he encountered God at that place. A town would later perpetuate the name in the form of Peniel. You say, well, why was it Peniel in the first time that Jacob said it, and Peniel in the very next verse where he said it? Well, remember, Moses, when he wrote it 500 years later, would have been talking about the city because It's in reference to that. And third, Jacob limped thereafter. It was a sign, as it says, until Jacob's death. It was a sign. We do well, as it says, to establish life markers that serve as reminders. I think of, even when we was reading through this, I was thinking of course it talks about too, Joshua and them raising up those 12 stones when they crossed over into Jericho. It's important that you and I make markers in our own spiritual lives. It may be a verse that means something to you. You take your pen out and say, man, that verse really spoke to me, and you mark it, highlight it, star it, however it is for you, that people know that that verse right there, it meant something to you. It stuck out. I want to encourage you. One, recognize who God is and complete your journey. Two, I want to encourage you to trust in what He is with all your fears, all your misgivings, everything that may lead us to go in the direction we don't need to follow what God calls us to in our journey. And third, when God's carried you through it, and He's accomplished through you or for you the things that He does, make sure people know. Set a reminder. Tell your children, and tell your children's children, and tell your children's children's children if you get to hang around that long. And if not, make sure that somebody's going to keep passing along how God had protected and taken care of you. Let's pray.